So, Eduardo Suárez, you're a very distinguished journalist from Spain. You've worked as a foreign correspondent for El Mundo. You've reported from New York, Brussels, London, and since then you've had a founding role in two digital news startups, El Español and Politibot. And you've also won the Gabriel Garcia Marquez Journalism Award too. But I'd like to focus a bit on Politibot to start with. Could you just tell me how it works and what the user sees when they access Politibot?
Great. Politibot is a new startup that we created in June 2016, just for the Spanish general election. Spain had just had another election 6 months before, and so we wanted to, cover it in another way, in an innovative way. So we created Politibot. At the start, it was just like a small project, and it was not even a company. It was just, like a couple of friends trying to do some cool stuff. We created this chatbot at the beginning just on Telegram, and the chatbot still sends you conversations, daily conversations about the news. We usually choose a topic, an interesting topic, something that needs explaining, something that it's not clear or should be dealt with in a conversational way. And we basically share with our users charts and articles and videos, audios, things that could explain that topic. At the beginning it was just about Spanish politics. Now we are doing other things like global politics, discussing things about the Mueller investigation and Donald Trump, or about European politics now that we have the European election. So that's basically what we do. We developed our content management system with the help of Google D&I fund, this innovation fund that Google has in Europe. So we are very grateful for that. That allowed us to license it to other news startups. We had a collaboration with a news project in Chile. It's three female journalists. They wanted to do a project similar to Politibot, and they've done it. It's called Robot Labot. And we also have this collaboration agreement with a book publisher in Spain, Penguin Random House. We do conversations about their books, and it is a very interesting conversation for us, very good, because the kind of books that they publish, they are usually journalism books or history books, non-fiction books. Those are the same kind of books that our readers love. So this is a very good agreement for us. It's kind of a native advertising thing, but it's super interesting for our readers, and those conversations are among the most successful that we have.
So how does a user actually interact with the bot? I mean, bot suggests some type of almost artificial intelligence. Who's sitting behind the bot, if you like, and then how does a user interact with it?
Yes, our chatbot is a very human chatbot. Our conversations are made every day by a person, by a journalist, and what the conversations look like is like a decision tree. And the conversation is something that the user can advance through buttons. We don't do open questions. We do like questions with different options, and the user can choose different options. Sometimes it looks more like a quiz, and we try to prove if our users know about something. Sometimes it's more like trying to explain some other things that are not very well explained about something that is happening. So it's basically a decision tree, and there's a person who builds the conversation beforehand. We usually tend to think about conversations that we have as newsletters, and we are kind of obsessed about measuring the success of the conversation and how far the user gets to if the user is getting as far as the end of the conversation. We can measure all that thanks to the content management system that we built, and we also are very interested in kind of the intersection between politics, policy, social science, those are the areas that we particularly cover, because we are not so much into, you know, daily news or things that bigger organizations are covering, but we are very much into polling, social science, interesting papers that are published about, you know, the salary gap between men and women, or about European issues or the immigration crisis. Those are the things that I think readers are looking for when they open our conversations.
Because I was going to ask, what value do you think Politibot provides compared to something like Twitter? But I suppose Twitter is something that you use to keep up with the kind of hour by hour, day by day conversation,
Sure.
whereas you see Politibot as taking a bit more of a step back and examining issues in that manner. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's totally right. We think of ourselves as some kind of curation service, and that's a lot of time our readers say precisely that. I mean, they really value the fact that we curate content and that once a day we send important things. We don't do like gossip. We don't do like some of the things that big organizations are doing in Spain to, you know, just to get money. So we just send essential stuff, and when Politibot sends you a message or a conversation, every of our readers knows that it's something that is important, or is a very interesting tidbit about something, or is a topic that they should really pay attention to. So I think that's definitely part of the appeal. And yeah, we think of ourselves as a conversational newsletter. We think that, I mean, we kind of cater to the daily briefers that the Reuters Institute report usually talk about. Those kind of people that are not news junkies and want to be, you know, on Twitter all the time, knowing what's new. We cater more to the people that, you know, they want to know, you know, interesting stuff once a day. We usually send our conversations in the morning, but some of the people consume them, you know, just in lunch at lunchtime. It takes like a couple of minutes sometimes to do the conversation, so it's not a long time, but it's usually a bite-sized content, but it's bite-sized content which really provides useful and interesting information. I think that's what's valuable about Politibot. And of course, apart from the chatbot, we started with the chatbot, but we do other things. We also do interactives, like about elections usually, but also about other stuff. We do a podcast. We've done a couple of seasons of the podcast, basically about global politics, European politics, also about Spanish politics as well. And we do events. We just done a very successful event in a Spanish bookstore in Madrid, just 4 days before the election, and we, you know, gather a couple of hundred people just to talk about policy, about misinformation, things that we are really, really interested in.
Now, obviously your main passion is journalism, but being involved in the founding of two startups, you obviously have to keep an eye on how you can keep these things commercially viable. How did you find yourself being able to balance these two interests, not necessarily competing, but two interests which you had to certainly keep on top of? Did you find yourself being drawn away from journalism, looking at the commercial aspect, or were you able to keep one foot firmly in both camps?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it's very difficult for us journalists to focus on the business side, because we have been told not to look at that. You know, they used to be like a Chinese wall, you know, separating the business side from the editorial side, for a good reason. But I think increasingly that's changing because of the nature of the digital products, you know, and the digital companies. Increasingly, success of a news organization is determined by how you integrate both sides in a good way. You know, of course, there are things that have to be separate, and you cannot, mix in, your revenue side and the kind of pressures from advertising with the editorial side. But you definitely have to think about the product in a holistic way. You have to really think about your product, and you really have to think about the revenue streams that you have. You know, in the case both are very different cases. El Español was a very big new startup. We got almost $4 million in crowdfunding, in a very successful crowdfunding operation. So we got lots of resources, and that was really lucky at the time. And we were really happy, especially how we conducted ourselves on social media in the first couple of months, and how that, and also our news coverage kind of helped the crowdfunding operation. But with Politibot, which is a side project for basically for all the founders, is not something that is not the main thing that we do. It is something that we would like to keep alive, because we have thousands of followers, and we also have people that support our work. Is also important, of course, even if it's such a small project. And but we don't want losses. We really want to be sustainable, and we try to do it, yes, as much as we can. Now we have several revenue streams. We license the content management system, as I told you before. We also have this agreement, native advertising agreement, with the book publisher, and we also have patrons. We have a couple of hundred people that give us between $1 a month and $20 a month, because basically they value the project, and they want to contribute in a membership, right? Now we are examining different things to keep sustaining Politibot, and of course one of them would be giving something special, some special content for our supporters that we haven't done yet. Now is a very altruistic proposition. Just you want Politibot to exist and you give money, but we would like to send or to do a more transactional proposition that I think actually is a trend now in the business. I think we used to think about reader revenue models more in very separate ways, like these guys who are more transactional and subscription based, and these other guys like The Guardian who are more memberships and donations and more altruistic stuff. Actually, I think we are seeing both camps coming a little bit closer right now. I mean, a newspaper like The Guardian, of course they have memberships and contributions, but they also have a more transactional proposition, and they have print subscriptions and print bundles, and they launched this Guardian Weekly magazine also. So they are coming this way. And also I think the subscription guys, the guys who are more transactional, they are also realizing the importance of having also a more emotional proposition, and telling to the readers, well, our brand is important for this and this and this. So I think that middle space is something that I think Politibot has to be in, and I think other newspapers are going to that space too.
I see. So lots of your research here has focused on all the different types of revenue models, many of which you've listed here. For anyone else thinking of even starting something remotely similar to what you've done so far, what are the kind of key considerations that they need to think about in terms of which revenue model is most appropriate, from the very closed membership model to the more open and relying on advertising? What do people need to consider?
Yeah, well, I think if you want to rely on advertising, you have to have a huge market. I mean, now the problem with digital advertising is that the CPM, the kind of money that you receive for every 1,000 visits in your website is super small and is shrinking. So that's a real problem. In terms of advertising, it's better to get some agreement with one-on-one agreement with companies that could support your work. But of course, advertising sometimes could be a risk, and some companies sometimes they want to decide what you publish and what you don't publish. So advertising, of course, is or in many news organizations is part of the revenue mix, but I think it's not a very safe bet, especially because it is the amount of money in digital advertising that goes to news organizations is shrinking because of the platforms, because most of the new dollars are going to the Googles and Facebook and Amazons. organizations. So I definitely think that reader revenue is super important, or should be super important for anyone thinking of founding a news organization. And in terms of the kind of value proposition, which is basically the most important thing that you have to think before, I mean, what are you adding? What you asked before about Politibot, I mean, why is this so special? Why are people going to support you, or why are people going to consume your content? In terms of value proposition, I think everyone should think about habit. Habits are super important, increasingly important. How you create a habit in your readers. It could be a daily habit, it could be a weekly habit, but you really need to think how to get into the daily routines of your audience. Maybe you send something in the morning that your readers like to consume when they are having breakfast or whatever, but or maybe it's just one article that you send, at dinner time, and they can read after dinner like a more long form piece, But you really have to think about that, especially because many current news organizations, at least in Spain, they don't think too much about that. And so there's an opportunity for new companies coming that really feeling the needs that some of the readers have, and maybe they are not addressed by the current companies.
Right. So of all the kind of conversations you've had around this subject, I imagine you've spoken to many senior journalists and editors who are all implementing different types of revenue models. What are the most valuable lessons that you think you've learned in your time here that you could either take back to Politibot or share with other people back home?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, the most interesting thing for me is that many news organizations now in Spain, especially the big news organizations like El País, El Mundo, La Vanguardia, and others, they are now thinking of paywalls and digital subscriptions. This is something that they haven't done before. I mean, El País did kind of an experiment in 2002, 3, something like that. It was not successful and they abandoned it. So now is a very foundational moment in Spanish newspapers. They are really thinking about digital subscriptions. So I really hope that the report that I produced after my fellowship, it is kind of useful for them. What I've tried is talking to many people working in news organizations, mostly in the UK and Spain, but also in other countries like Sweden and Italy and France. And of course, I come from the US. I've been spending like 5 years in the US, so I know what is happening there too, and I follow very closely the revolution that they did at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others. And in terms of lessons that can be applied to Spain, again, I definitely think that habit is something that is super important, and newspapers, it's going to be very difficult for many newspapers because newspapers in Spain are optimized for traffic, massive traffic. They compete in ComScore, and at the end of the month they like to be like ahead in terms of unique users. But I have the feel that unique users are going to be much less important in the new world, and they should think much more about heavy users. And maybe you have like 20 million people on ComScore, but most of those are just going there for just 1 second a month. So they stay just for 1 second. They are not very valuable. And then you have to focus in maybe 200,000 people that are actually coming back every day and reading your stuff, and those are the ones that you have to focus on, understand them better, and try to give them the kind of content that they consume. So that would be one thing. The other thing that I've learned here, and I also many people in the interviews have mentioned it, is what they call the finishability, this kind of quality that some news products have now that make them finishable, it is easy to go to the end. That is something that we do at Politibot too. Our conversations are very short, so it is easy for you to, it's just a couple of minutes or so that you can finish the conversation, and it's something that is also in other news products that I reviewed during my time in Oxford. The Economist has the Expresso, this kind of newsletter, and also like a news product in their app. And the concept is the same. I mean, that you actually can finish it in just 15 minutes or so. They are, and that's something that has to do also with the success of podcasts, for example. That every episode lasts just for 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and that adds value to someone's life without taking a long time. So I think that's something that provides satisfaction to the reader. The fact that the sense of achievement after finishing something that you're reading, I think that's super important, and has to do with other things like the success of the newsletters, for example, and other things. And if you are designing a news product, especially if you are focused on reader revenue, that's also important, because that creates habit again, and habit is important to get money from readers, and that creates like a virtuous cycle, hopefully.
So I get the impression that in Spain, news organisations are having similar conversations that we were having a few years ago. And now that you see where the UK media landscape is now, are you optimistic about the viability of the media in Spain, or pessimistic?
Yeah, I'm totally optimistic. Yeah, I'm a very optimistic person though, so so I'm not really. I mean, it's part of my nature, But definitely, I mean, the fact that and those are, I mean, Spain and the UK are very similar countries in many ways, in the sense that they both have a big language. This is not neither Spain or Britain or the Netherlands or or Denmark. Those small countries with very small language that acts as a mode in a way. And it's could be a limitation, but also is good for the business. In the case of Britain and Spain, I mean, Spanish and English are global languages, and that creates an opportunity in terms of market and advertising and big traffic, but it also is a limitation, and it could be difficult to build a proposition for your heavy users, and at the same time to have this big or cater to this big market outside your country. So the fact that so many British newspapers are being successful in terms of subscriptions, even if it's a limited success, and I know that we are not out of the woods in any way, and it's difficult and it's a struggle, but they are building a loyal readership. The Times the Times and the Sunday Times have 150,000 subscribers, digital subscribers. The Economist has, a huge subscriber base. The Guardian has just announced 1 million members and contributors worldwide. And very successfully in the global space. They are not just coming from Britain, they are coming from the US, from Australia. That's definitely something that gives hope, or should give hope to news organizations in Spain. And I know how tough is it, and it is super difficult to see the future, and because the processes, the priorities of the organizations are optimized for another thing, and just for traffic, and it's difficult to see. If you see here 20 million unique users and all the revenue that you have from advertising right now, and you look at the subscription base, and now you see that you don't have any. It is very difficult to focus on this, even if you know that the future is on subscriptions and that it is a more healthy proposition for the company. It's very difficult to change, and that's part of the reason why some of the questions that I asked during the interviews had to do with that, because I think that's very, very important, to know how to make that transition. Even if it's not a complete transition, of course, Spanish news organizations are going to have advertising as a revenue stream, definitely. But I think their success depends on them to get more money from the readers, which is a universal trend. Is happening everywhere in Europe too, in countries like not the usual suspects, like of course the Danish and the Norwegians and the Swedish, but also in places like France or Poland or even Italy. So it's happening everywhere. In Portugal, which is a very similar country to Spain in many ways. So the fact that we haven't started yet in Spain, there's a big exception to that, which is eldiario.es. It is a digital-only news organization in Spain, and it has been very successful. It was created in 2012, and now they have like 35,000 members, with a very similar model to The Guardian, but without a printed edition or any print product. More than they only have like a magazine that they produce every 3 months. But it's very successful, and 1/3 of the revenue comes from the readers. They got like 10,000 new subscribers or members last year because of a big scoop that they published about a politician. They published that she had faked their master's degree, and they got like 10,000 subscribers or members just in a couple of weeks. So that makes me really hopeful. That has to do with some that people feel the need to have independent journalism, especially in Spain, which is a country that has gone through a very difficult financial crisis, that has renewed its party system in the last few years. We used to have just 2 big parties, now we have like 5. So there are a lot of changes. There's also a generational change in Spain. And some of the subscribers or members at El Diario are young people too. So I'm really optimistic about that kind of environment. I think it's an environment where good journalism can flourish, and hopefully readers can help us do that. Hopefully that's going to be like a new and better time for Spanish journalism in the next few years.